Dawn, 19th June 1944, Philippine Sea. Low cloud lay like torn cotton over a steel-blue horizon, the air salted and metallic, the swell heaving under a thin haze of fuel smoke. A Japanese reconnaissance pilot, engine droning at a steady note and oil hot in the cockpit, peered through the slipstream for the carcasses his briefers promised, American carriers, crippled and burning after the last raid. Instead, out of the grey came a lean, slab-sided shape with the clean lines of the new Essex-class, USS Yorktown CV-10, cutting a white V at speed. Wind over her deck whistled. Tractors coughed. F-6F Hellcats idled in rows. From the pilot's altitude he saw the impossible. The carrier alive, turning into the wind and throwing aircraft into the sky. He wrote later that the sight struck like ice, because Tokyo's strike reports, filed 2 days earlier, had already listed a major American flat-top as finished, her deck torn and her engines stilled. Staff officers ashore had inked a red character beside her name, sunk, but the sea kept its own ledger. Yorktown, sister to USS Franklin in the same hard-built line, was back at 30 knots, the deck crew moving in practiced arcs, the arresting wires glinting, the first division of fighters lifting into the humid morning to guard the task force. Industrial America had built Essexes by the dozen, each nearly 27,000 tons standard. Yet on this morning what confounded the enemy was not tonnage, but tenacity. Somewhere below those armored decks, a 24-year-old machinist from Kansas had refused a verdict. Engineers had called the needed fix unworkable. A sailor's hands made it real. As Japanese controllers scrambled to reconcile maps with the living sea, the American formation tightened for the next strike, while our story turns to the blast, the damage no logbook expected, and the young man who would not let a carrier die. By the middle of 1944, the aircraft carrier was no longer a supporting player, it was the empire at sea. The Pacific, once ruled by the thunder of battleship guns, now echoed with the high-pitched whine of radial engines and the rhythmic thud of deck catapults. From the Coral Sea to Midway, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, the flat-topped giants of the U.S. Navy had rewritten the doctrine of naval warfare. The Essex-class carriers, 24 of them commissioned between 1943 and 1945, stood as the industrial embodiment of America's war machine. Each displaced nearly 27,000 tons standard and could surge to 33 knots under the combined power of 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower. Beneath their armored flight decks, the heart of each ship beat through a labyrinth of steel passageways, boiler rooms, machine shops, electrical control stations, and hydraulic systems that never slept. Aboard these floating cities lived over 10,600 men, pilots and ordnance men above, but also a hidden army of mechanics, welders and machinists' mates below. Their world was measured in pressure gauges, valve wheels, and the steady hiss of steam lines. A seized bearing or ruptured feed pump could strand a carrier as surely as a torpedo. Yet these men, anonymous and unsung, kept the Navy's lifeblood moving. Each Essex-class vessel carried roughly 90 aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers and Dauntlesses, each a hungry machine demanding fuel, maintenance and flight readiness that depended entirely on the invisible labor below decks. To Japanese strategists schooled in battleship duels and notions of martial honor, the idea that such a massive vessel could be struck, burned, and then returned to the line within 48 hours defied belief. They saw courage in a gun crew's last volley. The Americans saw it in a machinist's wrench and a welder's torch. That quiet revolution, engineering as endurance, would soon prove decisive. The next part of this story descends into the ship's bowels, where heat, pressure, and one sailor's resolve would determine whether the Yorktown sailed or sank. Commissioned on April 15, 1943, at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, the USS Yorktown, CV-10, entered the fleet not merely as a replacement for her namesake lost at Midway, but as the product of every lesson the U.S. Navy had paid for in blood and metal. She was longer, stronger, and faster than the ships that had preceded her. An Essex-class carrier designed for a global war that demanded both reach and resilience. Beneath her broad flight deck, armored against 500-pound bombs, 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers roared day and night, feeding superheated steam at nearly 400 degrees C to 4 Westinghouse turbines that drove her 4 bronze propellers. The combined 150,000 shaft horsepower could push the 27,000-ton warship through open ocean at more than 33 knots. In the infernal heat of the boiler rooms, men stripped to undershirts and sweat-blackened trousers worked amid thundering pistons and spinning shafts, their only light the orange glare from open furnace doors. Yorktown's early campaigns proved what that machinery could deliver. During the strikes on the Marshall Islands in January 1944, and later through the Marianas, she served as a relentless launch platform, sending hundreds of F-6F Hellcats and TBF Avengers into battle. Her flight crews lived by adrenaline, her engineering division by precision. Lieutenant Commander Robert J. Holmes, the ship's engineering officer, ran his department with the calm of a man who trusted discipline more than luck. "Systems," he later wrote, "are not built for miracles, they are built for men who do not fail." Yet even he could not foresee how close the Yorktown would come to needing one when Japanese bombs found their mark during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Shockwaves ripped through the ship's lower decks, bursting steam lines and silencing half her propulsion. The bridge weighed the grim prospect of towing her to Ulithi for extensive repairs, weeks out of the fight. But deep in the scorched belly of the ship, a young machinist's mate named Harold Denton stared at the ruined pipes and refused the idea of surrender. In that furnace-lit chamber, he made a decision no manual authorized, a decision that would test both the ship's design and the limits of human ingenuity. June 18, 1944, Philippine Sea. The morning had opened bright and deceptively calm. The horizon brushed in pale silver as Yorktown steamed with Task Force 58 toward Saipan. Below decks, the hum of turbines was constant, a living rhythm that meant the ship still breathed. Then the klaxons shrieked. Overhead, radar picked up a handful of fast-moving blips, breaking through the fighter screen. Moments later, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber burst from the clouds in a near-vertical plunge. The crew on the flight deck had only seconds to react before the sky tore open in a shriek of diving engines. The 500-kilogram armor-piercing bomb released from less than 2,000 feet, slicing through the deck plating near the starboard forward elevator. It detonated inside the hangar bay with a violent flash that split bulkheads and hurled aircraft into twisted ruin. The blast sheared steam lines in the forward engine rooms, and superheated vapor rolled through passageways like white fire. 2 of the carrier's 4 propeller shafts went dead within minutes. Men fled choking corridors, eyes seared, as the lights flickered and died. Power dropped by half. The elevators froze. Aircraft crews stumbled through smoke so thick it seemed to have weight. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Holmes ordered isolation of damaged compartments and full counter-flooding, trying to keep the carrier stable. By noon, Yorktown wallowed, dead in the water. Her forward section blackened, her flight deck buckled like warped steel cloth. Engineering estimates were grim. The main steam manifold was crippled, repairs at sea impossible. 2 weeks in a floating dry dock at Ulithi, they said. If she didn't sink first, to the Japanese the battle was already won. Radio Tokyo broadcast that Yorktown had been destroyed by gallant pilots of the Imperial Navy. But deep below, where steam hissed through cracked valves and the heat could boil skin, machinist's mate second-class Harold Denton was studying the maze of ruptured piping. While others saw chaos, he saw a path, a chance to reroute steam through redundant lines meant for auxiliary pumps. Kneeling in the sweltering dark, he pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket and began to sketch on a soot-black bulkhead, tracing a network only he believed could work. Around him, medics carried away the burned and wounded. Overhead, the ship groaned like something alive. Denton looked once toward the shuddering deck and whispered to no one in particular, "She's not dead yet." Harold Denton had never been meant for heroics. Born in 1920 in Topeka, Kansas, he grew up between the smell of machine oil and prairie wind, the son of a Santa Fe railway foreman who believed a man's worth was measured by the sound of a well-tuned engine. By 17, Harold was already working with compound steam locomotives, learning to read pressure through touch, the faint tremor of a valve, the way hot metal spoke when something was wrong. When he enlisted in the Navy in 1941, it wasn't out of adventure but fascination. He wanted to work with the biggest engines in the world. And the Essex-class carriers offered just that. Cities of steel driven by oceans of steam. Aboard the Yorktown, Denton was a machinist's mate second class in the engineering division, stationed in boiler room number 2. Shipmates described him as quiet and tireless, a man who talked to turbines when others slept. On June 18th, when the Japanese bomb tore through the carrier, he was at his post. The shock wave slammed through the boiler compartment like a giant's fist, throwing him against the bulkhead and shattering gauges. The heat that followed was unbearable. Steam leaking from ruptured lines turned the air into a living weapon. Denton and his crew crawled through it, sealing valves and shutting down burners, before the pressure tore the room apart. When the damage reports came in, engineers concluded the power plant was finished. 2 of the 4 shafts were cold, and half the steam manifold was ruptured. But as the officers prepared for tow, Denton remembered something from his days at the railway depot, the cross-feed system used to reroute steam between damaged boilers. It wasn't designed for ships, but it could work. He begged Lieutenant Commander Holmes for 2 hours and the freedom to improvise. Using scrap piping, clamps pulled from old fire mains, and gasket seals cut from rubberized canvas, Denton began building a bypass line by hand. One mistake, one weak weld, and the entire compartment could have become an inferno. But to him, that was better than letting the Yorktown die still and silent. The bridge gave him one night, and the Pacific held its breath. The heat in boiler room number 2 was enough to blister paint from the bulkheads. Thermometers showed 130 degrees Fahrenheit, but that only measured the air. Metal surfaces were far hotter, glowing faintly in the half-light of emergency lamps. Every few minutes, a valve spat steam with a shrill hiss, and the clang of hammers echoed through the labyrinth of pipes. For 2 nights, June 19 to 20, 1944, Harold Denton and a handful of men worked in that furnace, stripped to their undershirts and soaked in sweat that mixed with oil until their skin turned grey. They had only one purpose: bring the Yorktown back to life. The official schematic said the job was impossible. The forward manifold had been destroyed, the crossfeeds mangled, and the auxiliary pressure line wasn't rated for full load. But Denton saw a way. He ordered the crew to cut into an unused test manifold, normally employed only for dockside pressure calibrations, and reroute the steam flow through it. There were no proper fittings aboard, so they scavenged what they could. Spare couplings from the maintenance stores, fire main clamps, lengths of auxiliary pipe that barely fit. They hammered joints together with sledgehammers, packed cracks with asbestos paste, and bound them tight with wire lashings until their hands bled. The smell of burning insulation hung in the air like scorched cloth. At a 3:40 on June 20th, after nearly 20 hours of continuous work, Denton ordered steam pressure to be raised for a test. Men braced behind bulkheads, knowing that if a joint failed, the boiler would detonate like a bomb. The gauges climbed 50 psi, 100, 150. The pipes groaned but held. At 180 psi, Denton shouted for turbine engagement. Deep within the hull, something massive stirred. The shafts began to turn, slowly at first, 10 revolutions per minute, then 30, then 60. The ship trembled, quivered, and moved. By dawn, the Yorktown was under her own power again, delivering 60% of rated output, enough for 20 knots. The flight deck roared back to life, and by noon, Air Group 5 had launched 36 Hellcats and Avengers toward Guam. Engineers who later studied the repair called it a jury rig that defied physics. To Denton, it was just what had to be done. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese intelligence officers intercepted American radio traffic and refused to believe it. A ship they had declared sunk was now commanding airstrikes. That night, Yorktown steamed eastward under her own strength, alive again. Her miracle forged not by luck, but by the hands of men who refused to yield. When American radio traffic on June 21, 1944, confirmed that the Yorktown was once again conducting flight operations, Japanese naval intelligence dismissed it outright. Their analysts labeled it enemy deception, a psychological ploy meant to conceal losses or inflate strength. Only 2 days earlier, official communiques to Tokyo had celebrated her destruction, the product of a daring Judy bomber attack. But disbelief gave way to silence when reconnaissance flights over the Bonin Islands on June 22nd returned photographic evidence. a U.S. carrier matching Yorktown's configuration, a live, launching aircraft in perfect formation. For the staff of the Imperial Navy's Intelligence Bureau, the implications were unthinkable. The enemy they thought defeated was rebuilding itself at sea. Within days, internal reports circulated through the combined fleet's command rooms. Some engineers theorized that the Americans possessed modular engine units that could be replaced like cartridges. Others argued for self-contained steamless turbines or hidden tenders performing floating repairs. None dared suggest the truth that a handful of machinists had rerouted an entire propulsion system by hand. To a military culture steeped in the code of Bushido, such improvisation seemed beyond reason. American ships, one captured officer later wrote, appeared to heal like living creatures. The loss of face among pilots was severe. Men who believed they had struck decisive blows now faced an enemy whose steel seemed immortal. The psychological toll was deeper than any single battle. For the first time, Japan's naval command confronted not only American firepower, but an industrial resilience that defied logic. The Yorktown's revival spread like a rumor through carrier decks and briefing rooms, a symbol of a war machine that refused to die. Even the U.S. Navy kept the details secret for months, unaware of the legend forming across the ocean. By the time the truth reached Tokyo, Yorktown was already refueled, rearmed, and preparing for her next mission. The grim aftermath of the Marianas Turkey shoot. What allowed Harold Denton's miracle to happen was not chance or luck, but the philosophy built into every plate and rivet of the Essex-class carriers. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had come to see these ships not simply as fighting vessels, but as floating industrial ecosystems, self-sustaining war machines designed to survive isolation thousands of miles from any shipyard. Each Essex-class carrier carried more than 200 tons of spare parts, from turbine blades to wing struts, and maintained over 3,000 precision tools in onboard machine shops. Deep within their armored hulls were fully equipped fabrication rooms with lathes, presses, and welding rigs, capable of manufacturing replacement parts on demand. In a sense, each ship was both a factory and a fortress, able to repair not only its aircraft but itself. This doctrine of self-repair had been born from the trauma of Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Navy's post-1941 damage control schools taught sailors to treat steel as something alive, to sense its stresses, isolate its wounds, and patch its arteries of steam and wiring before the ship's pulse stopped. Every crewman was trained to improvise, to think as an engineer rather than a passenger of the machine. That culture, more than armor or firepower, kept ships like Enterprise, Bunker Hill, and Yorktown afloat when logic said they should sink. Denton's repair was the apex of that mindset, not defiance of procedure, but its evolution, the embodiment of a navy that trusted innovation at every level. In contrast, the Imperial Japanese Navy operated under rigid hierarchy, where deviation from orders was viewed as dishonor. Their carriers, elegant and deadly, could not adapt quickly once wounded. The Americans, by empowering even a machinist's mate to improvise, had unknowingly turned mechanical flexibility into strategy. Yorktown's recovery was no anomaly. It was proof that the Essex-class was built not just to fight wars, but to outthink them. By October 1944, the USS Yorktown had returned to full fighting strength, her decks spotless, her engines humming like new, and joined Task Group 38.1 for the coming storm at Leyte Gulf. It would be the largest naval battle in history, a clash of hundreds of ships spread across the Philippine archipelago. The Yorktown, once written off as lost, now led strikes with the confidence of a veteran. On October 24th, her air group joined the massed carrier raids that tore into the Japanese Central Force in the Philippine Sea. Avenger torpedo planes and Hellcat fighters rose from her deck in steady intervals, hammering enemy cruisers and battleships with a precision that left even veteran observers stunned. The next day, Yorktown's planes found and struck the Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor attack, sending her to the bottom under a storm of bombs and torpedoes. Below decks, the miracle that had once saved the ship continued to run quietly and perfectly. Denton's patched manifold, now permanently reinforced but still known affectionately as Denton's line, handled the full 600 psi steam load without failure. Sailors had etched his initials, HD, into the metal where his chalk marks once were, a small superstition that no one dared scrub away. Even when typhoon-like squalls swept across the Philippine Sea on October 25th, and other ships rolled hard to maintain formation, Yorktown held steady at 33 knots. The engine crews joked that she ran better in a storm than in calm seas. Japanese survivors of Leyte later wrote of an unending flood of American aircraft that seemed immune to fatigue or attrition. The illusion of American invulnerability had become reality. Denton, now a machinist's mate first class, refused promotion out of the engine room. "She runs," he told a war correspondent afterward, "because we don't give her a reason not to." In the crucible of Leyte Gulf, Yorktown proved that resilience itself was a weapon, and Denton's impossible repair had become part of the U.S. Navy's beating heart. The legend began not with headlines, but with whispers in the mess holes of the Pacific Fleet. By the end of 1944, stories of Harold Denton's miracle repair had drifted from ship to ship, how a machinist's mate from Kansas had brought a crippled carrier back from the dead with scrap metal, wire, and stubborn will. Sailors who had never seen the Yorktown began repeating it like gospel, the man who fixed a carrier with his hands. The Navy, careful about operational secrecy, never released official details, but the story traveled faster than any communique. For the men who lived by the rhythm of the boilers and turbines, Denton became a quiet hero, proof that even the smallest cog in the machinery of war could turn the tide. Above decks, pilots said they felt safer knowing men like him worked below. "If they can fix that," one Hellcat pilot remarked, "they can fix anything." Morale soared. Ships battered by kamikaze strikes or mechanical failures found courage in the idea that survival wasn't only luck, it was craftsmanship, endurance, and faith in one another. On the Japanese side, captured officers spoke with disbelief at how Americans laughed in the face of death, never realizing that the laughter came not from arrogance, but from trust, the knowledge that somewhere below, someone like Denton was still listening to the heartbeat of the ship. After the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Admiral Raymond Spruance toured the Yorktown and broke tradition. He climbed down into the engine spaces, heat still shimmering from the pipes, and shook Denton's grease-stained hand. There were no speeches, only a nod between two men who understood that victory in the Pacific had been built from the bottom up. Denton never sought glory. He kept working the turbines, head tilted to the hum of steam, listening as though the ship was speaking to him, and in a way, she was. In the weeks following the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Yorktown's engineering logs became required reading across the U.S. Pacific Fleet. What Harold Denton had done under fire, rerouting live steam through a jury-rigged manifold, was more than a miracle. It was a lesson in survivability. The Bureau of Ships immediately dispatched engineering officers to study his work firsthand. Out of their reports came Technical Bulletin 3427, issued in December 1944, titled Field Repair Routing Under Combat Conditions. The document cited the Yorktown by name and, in careful technical language, described Denton's method as unauthorized yet mechanically sound. For the first time, the Navy formalized the idea that initiative could replace procedure when procedure was impossible. The changes spread quickly. Future Essex-class carriers were retrofitted with reinforced cross-connect valves between their steam manifolds, designed to allow partial propulsion even after catastrophic damage. Training schools began, including Denton's original chalk sketch, preserved by Lieutenant Commander Holmes, as a case study in practical improvisation under duress. It became part of the Navy's new doctrine. Ships must be engineered not only for efficiency, but for endurance through human adaptability. Engineers were now taught to design for the man with a wrench in the dark, a phrase that would outlive the war itself. Across the Pacific, Japanese analysts studying post-battle reports reached their own conclusion. American ships display autonomous repair capacity beyond industrial norms. It was a bureaucratic admission of defeat, acknowledgement that U.S. warships had evolved from machines into organisms capable of self-healing. By early 1945, the new modular piping systems inspired by Denton's improvisation were being installed on carriers like Oriskany and Midway. And when kamikazes later tore into the fleet off Okinawa, these rapid repair doctrines saved lives again and again. What had begun in a blistering boiler room under fire became standard naval doctrine, the codification of courage through engineering. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, the USS Yorktown lay anchored at Eniwetok Lagoon, her deck still smelling faintly of oil and sun-baked steel. For months she had been a constant presence in the Pacific, striking, refueling, repairing, and striking again until there were no more enemies left to fight. Now, for the first time in years, her engines were silent by choice, not by damage. Below decks, the men who had lived in her bowels through heat and danger moved quietly, tending to idle turbines and sealed boilers. Among them was Chief Machinist's mate Harold Denton, older, leaner, and still listening to the hum of the ship, as if it might speak once more. He was recommended for the Navy Commendation Medal that autumn, but when informed of the ceremony, he refused. "Give it to the crew," he reportedly said. "No one fixes a carrier alone." He mustered out in 1946 and went home to Topeka, trading the roar of turbines for the familiar rhythm of locomotives on the Santa Fe line. To his neighbors, he was simply Harry the mechanic, a quiet man who rarely spoke of the war. For decades, his story remained buried in engineering logs, classified reports, and the memories of those who had sweated beside him in the inferno. Not until 1971 did the full account emerge, when naval historians uncovered Technical Bulletin 3427 and published The 48-Hour Miracle in Proceedings. By then, America's wars had moved to jungles and jet-age skies, but within the Navy's engineering schools, Denton's name endured, a whispered benchmark of skill and nerve. Today, the Yorktown rests as a museum ship, her engines cold but her story alive, the silent veins of steel still bearing the ghost of the man who once made them breathe again. Today, in Charleston, South Carolina, deep within the preserved hull of the USS Yorktown at Patriots Point, visitors can walk the narrow steel corridors once alive with heat and noise. Down in the engineering spaces, behind a clear plexiglass panel, rests a simple section of old piping labeled Denton's Line. The metal is scarred, its surface roughened by time, but that patch of steel embodies something larger than machinery. It represents the defiance of failure itself. What began as a desperate improvisation in 1944 has become an enduring lesson in how human ingenuity can outthink catastrophe. Modern naval engineers refer to Denton's work as an early example of adaptive resilience, the ability of human systems to bend, reconfigure, and survive when procedures collapse. That concept now lives far beyond warships. It guides aerospace redundancy design, nuclear plant safety models, even modern disaster response planning. The core idea is the same one Denton proved in the belly of a burning carrier. That flexibility, not perfection, is the ultimate safeguard. The Yorktown survival thus became more than a war story. It was a blueprint for how civilization itself learns to endure. For the Navy, the lesson was immortal. No matter how advanced the system, it is only as strong as the will to repair it. Denton's act stands beside the Doolittle Raiders' fuel improvisations, the Enterprise's patched decks, and the battlefield surgeons of Tarawa, all moments when human hands triumphed over the impossible. Walking through that quiet compartment today, one can still sense the echo of heat, the hum of valves, and the faith that once held steel together. His line held, and in a way so did history itself. The Japanese pilots who first glimpsed the USS Yorktown cutting through the smoke in June 1944 could not have known what they were truly seeing. To them, she was a phantom, an enemy carrier they had already claimed destroyed, now reborn and charging back into battle. They had no way to grasp that her resurrection had come not from factories in California or shipyards in Pearl Harbor, but from one man's refusal to surrender to the inevitable. In the endless, brutal expanse of the Pacific War, where metal melted, ships burned, and men vanished beneath the waves, Harold Denton's act stood as a quiet defiance of entropy itself. His impossible repair distilled the essence of the Allied war effort: courage welded to intellect, discipline fused with imagination. Every vibration of that patched turbine was a pulse of human will forcing steel to live again. The Yorktown was more than a ship that day. She was proof that even in an age of machines, it was still men who made miracles. When the war ended and her engines fell silent, their echo did not fade. It lingered in doctrine, in museums, in the whispered stories of sailors who learned that survival was an act of creation. The war produced heroes in cockpits and on beaches. This one worked in darkness beneath the waterline, listening to the heartbeat of a wounded ship. The Yorktown should never have moved again, but she did, because one man made her believe she could.